Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil as they follow the road laid out by the American pageant, occasionally taking unexpected turns to explore the side paths history often hides.
Welcome. Today we're taking a deep dive into a really critical period in American history, the years from 1763 right up to 1775.
Often called the Road to Revolution.
Exactly. And our goal here is to, really unpack the key events, the ideas taking root, and the turning points that pushed 13 quite distinct North American colonies towards the brink of war with Great Britain.
It's about understanding not just what happened, but digging into the why. We'll be drawing on historical analysis and hearing echoes from people actually living through it.
So where does the story really begin? Is it 1763?
Yes, 1763 is definitely a pivotal year. The end of the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, as it was known in America, is the major turning point.
A British victory, but a costly one.
Extremely costly. It left the British Empire with a huge national debt. It almost doubled, reaching somewhere between, say, 133 and 140 million.
Wow, that's enormous for the time.
It really was. And a significant chunk of that debt came from the costs of defending the American colonies during the war.
Okay, so the British government looks at this massive debt and thinks the colonies need to pay up.
Basically, yes. They felt it was fair, even necessary, for the colonists to contribute more directly to the ongoing costs of imperial administration and defense, especially their own defense.
And this meant a change in policy.
A big change. It signaled the end of a long period historians call salutary neglect. For decades, London had, mostly left the colonies to manage their own internal affairs.
Minimal interference.
Right. And during that time, colonial assemblies, their elected bodies, had grown quite powerful and accustomed to a fair degree of autonomy.
So the colonists had developed this strong sense of self-governance. How did they react when London started, tightening the reins?
Not well. They viewed these new measures not as fair contributions, but as overreach, an infringement on liberties they believed they possessed as Englishmen, and on the self-governance they'd long practiced.
It disrupted the status quo they were used to.
Completely. They saw their own assemblies as the rightful authority for internal matters, especially taxation.
Let's talk about the first major point of friction then, the Proclamation of 1763. What was that about?
Essentially, the British government drew a line down the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. They declared the lands west of that line off limits to colonial settlement for the time being.
Why? What were the British trying to achieve?
Two main things. First, prevent costly conflicts with Native American tribes. Pontiac's rebellion, which had just happened, was a brutal reminder of that danger.
Okay, and the second reason?
To manage westward expansion in a more controlled, orderly, and frankly less expensive way from London's perspective.
But colonists, especially those on the frontier or land speculators, they didn't see it that way.
Not at all. Many felt they'd fought the war precisely to open up those western lands. They saw the proclamation as blocking their ambitions, their opportunities, and honestly, many simply ignored it and moved west anyway.
So resentment building already. Then comes the Sugar Act in 1764. Now, I understand it actually lowered the tax on molasses, but it still caused a big stir. Why?
That's right, the duty was lowered. But the key difference was the purpose and the enforcement. Previous acts were mostly about regulating trade within the empire. The Sugar Act, however, explicitly aimed to raise revenue for the crown.
Ah, so it's the shift from trade regulation to direct revenue raising that's the issue.
Precisely. And it also involved stricter enforcement measures. Crucially, it expanded the use of vice admiralty courts.
And those were courts without juries?
Exactly. Cases involving smuggling or violations of the Sugar Act could be tried by a judge appointed by the Crown, not a jury of local colonists. This was seen as a direct threat to the fundamental English right of trial by jury.
So even with a lower tax, the principle of Parliament taxing them for revenue and the changes to the legal system, that's what really angered them.
Yes, especially in places like New England, where the molasses trade was vital for the rum industry. Protests erupted. Concerns about taxation without consent and these legal rights started circulating. And you begin to see the early formation of committees of correspondence.
These committees, they were for sharing information between colonies.
That's right, a way to coordinate responses and share grievances. It's an early sign of intercolonial cooperation starting to bubble up.
And the Currency Act came in the same year, 1764. More economic pressure.
It was. The Currency Act restricted the colonies from issuing their own paper money. They had to use hard currency gold and silver, which was chronically scarce in the colonies.
What was the British rationale?
They wanted to stabilize the currency system and protect British merchants, who were often forced to accept colonial paper money that could depreciate in value.
But for the colonists?
It felt like another impediment to their economic activity, another way London was interfering in their affairs and limiting their autonomy.
Okay, so we have debt, the proclamation line, the Sugar Act's revenue goal and court changes, the Currency Act. The pressure is definitely building. Which brings us to 1765 and the Stamp Act. This feels like a real escalation.
It absolutely was a major, major turning point. The Stamp Act was different. It was a direct internal tax levied by Parliament.
What do you mean by internal tax?
Unlike the Sugar Act, which taxed imports, external trade, the Stamp Act taxed items within the colonies. It required colonists to buy special stamped paper for all sorts of things: legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, even playing cards and dice.
And the purpose?
Explicitly to raise funds to help pay for British troops stationed in North America after the war.
The reaction must have been intense.
Immediate and widespread outrage. This is where the slogan, "No taxation without representation," really catches fire.
Let's unpack that phrase. What was the core argument?
It drew heavily on long-standing English constitutional tradition. The colonists argued that it was a fundamental right of Englishmen not to be taxed, except by their own consent, given through their elected representatives.
And they had no representatives in the British Parliament in London.
None at all. Their argument was that only their own colonial assemblies, elected by them, had the legitimate authority to levy direct internal taxes on them. Patrick Henry's Virginia Resolves were an early, fiery assertion of this principle.
So this wasn't just about the money, it was about a fundamental principle of governance and rights.
Absolutely. It went to the heart of their understanding of their relationship with Britain and their rights as subjects of the crown.
And this led to actual coordinated action, the Stamp Act Congress.
Yes, in October 1765, delegates from 9 colonies met in New York. This was really the first significant unified political action taken by the colonies themselves in response to British policy.
What did they achieve?
They issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances. It affirmed loyalty to the king, but strongly asserted their rights as Englishmen, crucially, the right to be taxed only by their own legislatures and the right to trial by jury, both of which they felt the Stamp Act and the expanded Vice Admiralty courts violated.
So formal political protest, but there was also economic action, right? Boycotts.
Yes, the non-importation agreements. Colonial merchants, artisans, and consumers organized boycotts of British goods. This hit British manufacturers and merchants where it hurt their wallets.
How effective were these boycotts?
Very effective. The economic pressure was significant. British businesses reliant on the American market started lobbying Parliament hard to repeal the act.
And Parliament did repeal it in March 1766, a colonial victory.
It certainly felt like one of the colonies. There were huge celebrations, but there was a catch.
What was the catch?
On the very same day they repealed the Stamp Act, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act.
What did that say?
It stated, in no uncertain terms, that Parliament had the full power and authority to make laws binding the American colonies in all cases whatsoever.
So they repealed the specific tax, likely due to the economic pressure, but they doubled down on the principle.
Precisely. They gave way on the Stamp Act, but they absolutely did not concede the fundamental issue of Parliament's ultimate sovereignty over the colonies. The core constitutional conflict remained unresolved.
It feels like even when things calmed down, the underlying tension was still there, maybe even stronger because of the Declaratory Act.
That's a good way to put it. And this whole crisis really forced colonists to think more deeply about their political philosophy, about the basis of their resistance.
Right, it wasn't just reacting anymore. An ideology was forming. You mentioned no taxation without representation. How did the British respond to that specific argument?
The British argued for something called virtual representation.
Virtual representation.
The idea was that members of Parliament didn't just represent the specific district that elected them, but that they represented the interests of all British subjects everywhere in the empire, including the American colonies.
Did the colonists buy that?
Not at all. They rejected it outright. They insisted on actual representation, being represented by people they actually elected, who lived among them, understood their local circumstances, and were directly accountable to them.
And they kept referring back to their rights as Englishmen. What specific rights were they emphasizing?
Core rights, they believed, were part of their English heritage. Protection against arbitrary government power, the right to trial by a jury of their peers, and, centrally, No taxation without their own consent expressed through their representatives.
Beyond English tradition, were other ideas influencing them? We often hear about the Enlightenment.
Definitely. Enlightenment thinkers, especially John Locke, were hugely influential. His ideas about natural rights, life, liberty, property, the idea of a social contract between the rulers and the ruled, and critically, the right of the people to resist a government that becomes tyrannical.
That provided a powerful justification.
Absolutely. It gave them a philosophical framework for arguing that the British government was potentially violating the social contract and infringing on their natural rights.
And there was also this radical Whig ideology.
Yes, this was a strain of British political thought deeply suspicious of government power, particularly executive power. It constantly warned about the dangers of corruption and the need to vigorously defend liberty against encroachment by power.
Colonists seemed to really embrace that worldview.
They did. They tended to interpret British actions, the new taxes, the standing army, the expanded powers of royal officials, through this Whig lens, seeing them as potential evidence of a plot against their liberties.
How were these ideas spread? How did they build consensus?
Pamphlets were incredibly important. They were relatively cheap to produce and distribute, and they became the main medium for political debate.
Any key examples?
Oh, many. James Otis Jr.'s arguments against general search warrants, Daniel Delaney's sophisticated analysis of taxation, Richard Bland in Virginia, and later, perhaps most famously, John Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania.
What did Dickinson argue in those letters?
Dickinson wrote a series of 12 letters, published widely in newspapers, arguing eloquently but moderately against the Townshend Acts. He stressed that Parliament had no right to tax the colonies for revenue, regardless of whether the tax was internal or external, making a powerful case based on constitutional principles and rights. These pamphlets helped shape public opinion and solidify the resistance ideology.
Okay, so after the Stamp Act repeal and the Declaratory Act, things maybe quieted down for a bit, but then the Townshend Acts arrive in 1767, a new round of trouble.
Yes, after a brief lull, Charles Townshend, Britain's finance minister, decided to try raising revenue again. This time, through import duties on goods like glass, lead, paper, paint, and significantly tea.
So these are taxes on imports, external taxes. Didn't some colonists accept Parliament's right to regulate trade?
Some had made that distinction earlier, but the explicit purpose here was again revenue. And crucially, Townshend planned to use this revenue to pay the salaries of royal governors and judges in the colonies.
Why was that so inflammatory?
Because traditionally, colonial assemblies controlled the salaries of royal officials. This power of the purse was their main leverage over the governor. By making officials independent of the assemblies for their pay, the Townshend Acts threatened to undermine the assembly's power significantly.
And there were other parts to these acts, too.
Yes. They also created a new American Board of Customs Commissioners based in Boston to enforce the acts more rigorously and expanded, again, the use of those unpopular vice admiralty courts.
So how did the colonies react this time, similar to the Stamp Act?
Similar tactics, but perhaps more organized. Non-importation agreements were revived and became more widespread. Boycotts were crucial again.
And this is where we see groups like the Daughters of Liberty becoming active.
Absolutely. Women played a really significant role. The Daughters of Liberty organized spinning bees, promoted wearing homespun cloth instead of British textiles, and encouraged boycotts of tea. It was a way for women to actively participate in the political resistance.
And we mentioned Dickinson's letters, and Samuel Adams wrote the Massachusetts Circular Letter around this time, too.
Yes. Adams drafted a letter for the Massachusetts Assembly, condemning the Townshend Acts as unconstitutional and urging other colonies to coordinate their resistance. While the British government ordered other colonies to ignore it, it actually helped foster greater intercolonial communication and unity.
Tensions seem to be rising steadily, especially in Boston, with the new customs commissioners. This leads us to the Boston Massacre in March 1770.
A very tense situation. You had British troops stationed in Boston to protect the customs officials and enforce the unpopular acts. There were constant friction and clashes between soldiers and civilians. On March 5, 1770, things boiled over.
What exactly happened?
A confrontation between a squad of British soldiers and a crowd of Bostonians escalated. The soldiers fired into the crowd, killing 5 colonists, including Crispus Attucks.
This became a huge propaganda victory for the Patriots, didn't it?
Absolutely. Leaders like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere immediately seized on it. Revere's famous engraving, though not entirely accurate, depicted soldiers firing deliberately into a peaceful crowd. It was incredibly effective in galvanizing anti-British feeling across the colonies.
In the aftermath, did the British back down at all?
Partially. Faced with the ongoing boycotts and the volatile situation highlighted by the massacre, Parliament repealed most of the Townshend duties in 1770, but crucially, they kept the tax on tea.
Why leave the tea tax? Just to make a point.
Exactly that. It was a symbolic gesture to maintain the principle established by the Declaratory Act that Parliament did have the right to tax the colonies.
So another temporary calm, but the core issue lingers. And during this relative quiet period, the committees of correspondence become even more important.
Yes, they really took off. Samuel Adams was instrumental in reviving the Boston Committee in 1772. Then, in 1773, Virginia proposed establishing formal intercolonial committees. Most colonies soon followed suit.
What was their function now?
They became a vital communication network, sharing news of British actions, coordinating strategies, shaping public opinion, and essentially building the infrastructure for unified colonial action. They were critical in mobilizing resistance to the next major crisis, the Tea Act.
Right, the Tea Act of 1773. This one seems counterintuitive. Didn't it actually make tea cheaper for the colonists?
It did, potentially. The act wasn't designed to raise new taxes. Its main goal was to bail out the struggling British East India Company by granting the company a monopoly to sell its tea directly in the colonies, bypassing colonial merchants and allowing the tea to be sold at a lower price, even with the existing Townshend tea duty still in place.
So if the tea was cheaper, why the massive outcry? Why the Boston Tea Party?
Colonists saw it as a trick, a clever ploy to get them to buy the taxed tea, and therefore implicitly accept Parliament's right to tax them. It was about the principle, not the price. Plus, colonial merchants who traded in tea were furious about being cut out by this monopoly.
So it united constitutional principle with economic grievance.
Precisely. Resistance was widespread. Tea agents appointed by the East India Company were intimidated into resigning. Ships carrying the tea were often turned away from ports.
But not in Boston.
Not in Boston. The royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, was determined the tea would be landed and the tax paid. The patriots were equally determined it wouldn't be. The standoff led directly to the night of December 16, 1773.
The Boston Tea Party.
Yes. Dozens of colonists, loosely disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded the 3 tea ships docked in Griffin's Wharf and dumped about 342 chests of tea, a huge amount, worth a considerable sum, into Boston Harbor.
A very dramatic, very defiant act. How did Britain react?
With fury. The destruction of private property on that scale, the open defiance of parliamentary law, it was seen in London as intolerable. There was a widespread feeling that Massachusetts, and Boston in particular, had gone too far and needed to be punished severely.
And this punishment came in the form of the coercive acts, or as the colonists called them, the intolerable acts, in 1774.
That's right, a series of punitive laws aimed squarely at Massachusetts to bring it to heel.
What did they do specifically?
First, the Boston Port Act closed the harbor to all shipping until the town paid for the destroyed tea, a devastating economic blow.
Okay, what else?
The Massachusetts Government Act drastically altered the colony's charter, restricting town meetings and increasing the power of the royally appointed governor at the expense of the elected assembly.
Taking away self-government.
Essentially, yes. Then the Administration of Justice Act allowed British officials accused of capital crimes, while performing their duties, to be sent to Britain, or another colony for trial, away from potentially hostile local juries. Colonists called it the Murder Act.
And there was a new quartering act.
Yes, a more stringent version, making it easier for commanders to house troops in private buildings if necessary.
And around the same time, the Quebec Act was passed, which also alarmed the colonists, even though it wasn't technically part of the coercive acts package.
Right. The Quebec Act extended the boundaries of Quebec southward into territory claimed by several colonies, established French civil law there, and granted official toleration to Roman Catholicism.
Why did that bother the largely Protestant colonists so much?
They saw it as another threat, blocking westward expansion again, promoting Catholicism, which they distrusted, and establishing a less representative form of government on their borders. It all fit into their fears about British intentions.
So the British intent with the coercive acts was to isolate and punish Massachusetts. Did it work?
It backfired spectacularly. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, the harshness of the acts horrified the other colonies. They saw it as an attack on the liberties of all Americans. If Parliament could do this to Massachusetts, they could do it to any colony.
So it actually fostered unity.
Immense unity. Food and supplies poured into Boston from other colonies, and most importantly, it led directly to the calling of the First Continental Congress.
Which met in Philadelphia in September 1774. What was the mood there?
Determined. Delegates from 12 colonies Georgia didn't send delegates initially gathered to formulate a common response to the intolerable acts.
What were the key outcomes?
They endorsed the Suffolk Resolves, which were radical resolutions passed in Massachusetts urging resistance, including non-obedience to the new acts and military preparation.
And they established the Continental Association.
Yes, this was crucial. It called for a complete boycott of British goods non-importation starting December 1774, non-consumption, and a plan for non-exportation to Britain if grievances weren't addressed by September 1775.
How is this enforced?
Through local committees of inspection set up in towns and counties across the colonies. These committees effectively became powerful local bodies, monitoring compliance, sometimes using pressure and public shaming. They represented a significant shift of authority away from traditional structures.
Were there debates within the Congress? Was everyone on the same page about resistance versus reconciliation?
Oh, definitely not. There was a range of opinions. More conservative delegates, like Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania, proposed a plan of union, a kind of formal constitutional arrangement between Britain and the colonies.
What happened to that?
It was narrowly defeated. The more radical voices pushing for stronger resistance ultimately carried the day on key measures.
But they did still try to appeal to Britain.
Yes, they drafted a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, reiterating colonial objections to parliamentary taxation and the intolerable acts, but still acknowledging Parliament's right to regulate external trade. They also sent a direct petition to King George III, hoping he might intervene.
And they agreed to meet again.
Critically, yes. They resolved that if their grievances weren't redressed by May 1775, a Second Continental Congress would convene.
So, political action, economic pressure. But was there also a sense that violence was becoming more likely?
Increasingly so. The Suffolk Resolves had urged militias to drill. In Massachusetts, the extra-legal provincial Congress was effectively governing outside Boston and actively organizing and arming militia forces, the famous Minutemen.
Stockpiling weapons.
Yes, gathering arms and ammunition. The enforcement of the association, while often peaceful, could involve coercion. There was a growing realization on both sides that the standoff might well lead to armed conflict. The road was nearing its end.
It's an incredible sequence of events, actions, and reactions. Looking back at this whole period, 1763 to 1775, with the hardening positions, the deep disagreements over rights and power, here's something to think about. Was war truly inevitable by early 1775? Or do you think there were still plausible paths to reconciliation, paths that maybe weren't taken? What might those have looked like?
That's the perennial question, isn't it? Hindsight makes conflict seem destined, but maybe it wasn't. Perhaps if Britain had offered more meaningful concessions on taxation and representation earlier, or perhaps if colonial leaders had pursued compromise more vigorously alongside resistance. But the level of mistrust by 1774-1775 was so high. The fundamental disagreement over Parliament's authority seemed almost unbridgeable. Any path of reconciliation would have required, I think, a fundamental rethinking of the imperial relationship from both sides, and that, it seems, was just too difficult by then.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.